K2 is a fearsome pyramidal peak of granite located on the border of the remote Gilgit-Baltistan region of Pakistan and its neighbor, China. K2 is one of only 14 peaks across the entire globe to reach an altitude of 8,000 meters or greater at its summit. K2 towers over the surrounding landscape, reaching a height of 8,611 meters at its apex, which earns it the distinction of being the second highest peak on the planet, with only Mount Everest reaching an overall greater altitude at its summit. While it is lesser in overall height than Mount Everest, K2 commands a similar level of general name recognition, as throughout the years, K2's name has become synonymous with danger and difficulty, as the peak has earned this infamous reputation on account of its particularly noteworthily high mortality rate, as just under 15% of climbers that attempt to ascend K2 will not leave the mountain slopes with their lives intact. This is a sharp increase when compared to Mount Everest, which boasts a much lower mortality rate of just under 3%. So infamous is K2's reputation, in fact, that I'd wager that if you were to ask most people what they know about the mountain K2, they'd likely tell you that it's deadly and extremely difficult to ascend, and maybe even is the hardest mountain in the world to ascend. Within the mountaineering community, it is this widespread infamy that has made an ascent of K2 such an appealing prospect to intrepid mountaineers, as successfully completing an ascent of K2 is an undeniable testament of a climber's skill, even to those outside of the mountaineering community. If you're a frequent viewer of my mountaineering videos, you're assuredly aware that while K2 is certainly a difficult and undeniably deadly peak to ascend, it is far from the most difficult or dangerous peak in the Karakoram range, no less the entire world to ascend, as K2's high mortality rate is in large part a result of its popularity rather than its technical difficulty. In fact, many of the world's most dangerous and difficult peaks are so daunting a prospect that only a handful of mountaineering's upper echelon have even dared to brave their slopes. A perfect example of one such peak is, well, K1, a 7,821 meter peak that is so difficult and dangerous that only 4 teams have ever reached its summit, with the last successful ascent taking place nearly 40 years ago in the year 1985. However, while within the mountaineering community, a successful ascent of K1 would inevitably be a much more noteworthy accomplishment than a successful ascent of K2 due to its lesser overall height, general obscurity, and possibly even its name, it would, at least on paper, appear to those unfamiliar with mountaineering to be a lesser ascent. Thus, because of the general recognition of an ascent of K2, it has become the holy grail ascent for many mountaineers to add to their climbing resumes, and so throngs of mountaineers annually flock to K2's slopes, and inevitably, a not insignificant number of them will not return. One of the most well-known and well-documented tragedies across the sport of mountaineering transpired on K2 slopes in 2008, a series of deadly incidents in large part caused by falling serac ice, and this series of events would ultimately result in 11 climbers losing their lives that season. However, lesser widely known about is that just 2 years prior, an eerily similar incident would occur on the upper slopes of K2, a deadly incident at K2's infamous bottleneck. K2's bottleneck, for those watching this that are unfamiliar with it, is a narrow couloir located just 1,300 feet below K2's summit. True to its name, the couloir narrows as it rises, like a bottleneck. This section of the climb is notably gut-wrenching for summit hopefuls to navigate through on their ascents, as the gully is overhung by a massive, looming serac, which has the omnipresent possibility of a large chunk breaking loose at any given time, which will inevitably cause powerful avalanches to form in its wake as the large chunks of ice from the serac tumble down K2's slopes and loosen the vast quantities of snow deposited there. However, as it is a necessity to navigate the bottleneck during a standard ascent of K2 via the standard Abruzzi Spur route, it serves as the final major obstacle for summit hopefuls to overcome during their bids for the summit. Notably, circumnavigation of the bottleneck, both on the ascent and descent, must be completed on a singular summit day, as the bottleneck lies within the death zone, which begins at an elevation of above 8,000 meters, where the oxygen concentration in the surrounding air is so low that humans are unable to sustain their normal bodily functions even while at rest. In the summer of 2006, a team of experienced Russian climbers, led by a man named Yuri Utashev, would arrive at the foot of K2's imposing slopes, excited for their upcoming attempt to reach the summit, but also well aware of the numerous hardships that they would inevitably face as they attempted their ascent. Following their arrival at the peak, the expedition team would begin the arduous legwork needed in order for them to successfully accomplish their goals, and set to work fixing their ropes along their route, along with establishing their fixed camps up the mountainside, frequently ascending, descending, and ascending repeatedly as they hauled their equipment from base camp up to the higher camps on K2 slopes. This gear hauling process also served to assist the climbers in acclimatization to high altitudes, a vital process for mountaineers to undergo to avoid the potentially deadly consequences of altitude sickness. However, this rudimentary hauling process was certainly not an easy one for the expedition team, as during the 2006 climbing season, K2 was frequently barraged by powerful storm systems, which slowed the team's vertical progress up K2 slopes to a glacial pace, as they were frequently forced to wait out these storm systems for days at a time. This frequent foul weather was a source of frustration not only for the Russian team, but also for the other expedition teams on the mountain that season as well. And over the course of the month of July, the other teams, one by one, began to abandon their attempts, and with each passing day, a successful ascent of the peak seemed increasingly unlikely. However, as the other teams began to call it quits, despite the numerous hardships they inevitably would face in order to continue their ascent, the Russian expedition team remained steadfast in their ambition to reach the summit, and by the last few days of July, they remained the only summit team still on the mountain. However, since the team had spent weeks preparing for a potential summit push, and had rather slowly plodded their way up the peak due to the harsh weather, by these final few days of July, the Russian team was beginning to run low on supplies, and thus the expedition party agreed that if they were unable to make a push for the summit by August 13th, they would be forced to abandon their attempt like the others. Over the following few days, the Russian mountaineers would begin to ascend to their high camps as the weather allowed, in order to better position themselves for a summit push should there be a break in the string of storms. On the morning of August 2nd, they saw their opportunity to make such a push arise, with only a scant few clouds scattered across the sky above, and upon realizing this, the team eagerly intended to capitalize on this good weather window and immediately began their push for K2's summit. However, as the day wore on, another powerful storm cell rapidly approached K2, and thus the team decided to abandon this summit attempt and retreated to their camp located at an elevation of 6,700 meters, where they hunkered down in their tents as the storm battered the peak slopes over the course of the next 11 days. On August 13th, 2006, the team's summit cutoff date, the weary climbers emerged from their tents to find that while the storm system still raged on below them, their camp at 6,700 meters was situated high enough that it was above the storm clouds, and the climbers were greeted by rays of warm sunshine from the cloudless sky above. The team's summit push on August 13th, unlike a majority of the climbing they had done so far, was going exceedingly smoothly, and the expedition team had opted to separate into 3 groups of climbers, with 2 climbers leading the charge to the summit, followed by a group of 4 climbers, with the final group of 3 climbers following behind them. The leading duo of climbers had made their way through the infamous bottleneck and had begun their ascent on the crest above it, meaning that they were in the home stretch of the ascent, with only about 2 hours of further ascending before they would reach the summit. However, as the leading duo reached an approximate altitude of 8,350 meters, the team's fortunes would suddenly take a drastic turn for the worse. As the pair of lead climbers plodded their way up K2's slopes and to an elevation of 8,350 meters, suddenly, and without any prior warning, a huge chunk of an overhanging serac measuring approximately 120 meters by 80 meters broke loose from K2's upper slopes, and with almost no time to react, the lead duo were struck by the ice and swept up by the resulting avalanche, with the huge slab of ice slicing through their ropes and subsequently pinning the ropes beneath its tremendous weight, causing it to literally drag the 2 climbers by their ropes behind it. As the increasingly powerful avalanche cascaded down the mountainside towards the bottleneck, the slide, which had been unusually quiet, swept up the second group of unsuspecting mountaineers, as they had neither heard nor seen any signs of it before it was too late. The third team, at the rear, which at this point had just reached the crest above the bottleneck, noticed the commotion of the avalanche on the slopes above them, and, with no time nor space to attempt to maneuver out of its path, they dug their ice axes into the crest and braced for impact. By the time that the huge slab of serac cascaded over the crest and spilled into the bottleneck, fortunately, the leading pair of climbers' ropes had severed, and rather miraculously, both were able to arrest their slides before they too were launched by the force of the avalanche into the couloir below. As the cloud of snow left in the wake of the avalanche began to settle, the group of 3 climbers who had been at the rear of the team emerged unharmed, as the small amount of forewarning they had, combined with their fortuitous location on the crest, had given them time to brace for impact, and a large majority of the mass of the slide had launched over the crest and right over them. However, as the leading and rear climbers regrouped, they quickly realized that the 4 climbers in the middle party had not been as fortunate as they had, as there was no trace of any of them. In wake of the avalanche, the remaining 5 climbers of the expedition team frantically searched the avalanche debris field, which stretched from an altitude of approximately 8,400 meters to an altitude of 7,800 meters. However, their searches turned up no further traces of the missing men, and so the team radioed local officials to inform them of the dire situation that had unfolded high on K2's slopes. Unfortunately, due to the extreme elevation of the incident, there was little that local officials could do to assist the climbers, as it was too high up to search using a helicopter, which typically cannot operate above an altitude of around 5,000 meters. Furthermore, there weren't any climbers still on K2's slopes that could be lobbied for assistance either, and to add to the already dire situation for the Russian mountaineers, yet another powerful storm system was rapidly approaching K2. Thus, after searching for as long as they possibly could for their compatriots, the remaining 5 climbers made the agonizing decision to abandon their search for the missing men and descend to the safety of base camp while the weather still allowed. And by the evening of August 13th, all 5 surviving climbers successfully descended to base camp with heavy hearts, but their lives still intact. The men who were lost in this unfortunate event were expedition team leader Yuri Utashev, a man named Alexander Voigt, a man named Pyotr Kuznetsov, and a man named Arkady Kuvakin. Thank you all for watching.